Hey everybody, this is Pastor Alan Hathaway here. Glad you joined me for this particular message. I'll be talking to you a little bit about what's in a day, and I'll be looking a little bit at the concepts from Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 19, and John chapter 11, verses 8 through 10. I thought about this whole concept as we are looking at the 4th of July tomorrow, and experiencing what it means to be a nation. We are clearly divided, and according to the very latest poll I heard yesterday, our nation is at the first time since polling's been done on this, that more people in the United States are, they're not real proud to be Americans, and that's troubling for me. It's troubling because I am proud to be an American. I'm proud of the privilege of having lived in this land, and it is a privilege to live in the United States. But I do know there are big problems in our country right now, and probably not problems like this. We've not had these kind of problems since probably close to the Great Depression. And so those are troubling things within our culture. Troubling problems that we're going to have to deal with going forward. But I am reminded that this is not the only time in our nation's history when there have been troubles and difficulties. And you can go back to the very founding of our country to find those kinds of problems and difficulties. I am very confident in our country if Christ tarries and if we reaffirm our commitment to the principles that founded our country, I do believe that we can pull out of this, and I am confident in the American people and people around me. I have a lot of confidence in them. So I come at this with a sense of confidence. That doesn't change the fact of the problems and the difficulties, but it does mean that I'm confident. What's in a day? Jesus had an interesting experience with his disciples in John chapter 11. We often focus on the latter part of that chapter, which is the story of the raising of Lazarus from the dead. But what struck me was when I was reading over that again was the first part of that chapter. Not the part where Jesus ignores the message for 2 days, but the statement where Jesus decides to go. And what's caught me again and again in that particular part of that entire story is that Jesus says to his disciples, now is the time to go back to Judea. It was easy for his disciples to understand why Jesus wouldn't be going back to Judea. If you look back in chapter 10, things did not go well the last time he was in Jerusalem. It had been a very ugly situation. A mob had developed in the street, and Jesus had had an ugly, ugly kind of running argument with them to the point that it devolved into a situation where they wanted to stone him, and literally the text of John says they were picking up stones and searching for stones that they could throw at him and stone him to death. And so it got ugly really fast. And so the disciples it was easy for them to understand why Jesus wouldn't be going to Bethany where Lazarus lived, because that was only about 4 miles from the city of Jerusalem. So it was well within the reach of the authorities and the mobs in Jerusalem. And certainly there'd be a good reason not to go there for that purpose. And Jesus uses some interesting language. It's language in the first part of chapter 11 that mirrors the language that begins the incident in chapter 10. He talks about light and darkness and day and night, and working our way through the day and night of life. And that was an interesting concept because we often live in these these light and dark moments. There's a moment when things transition, as it were. It's interesting that the Hebrew day, Yom, began in the evening at sunset and ended at the next sunset. That was considered a 24-hour day for the Jewish people. In their concept, things radically changed. While the word Yom could mean a daylight hour when people worked, and Jesus uses it in that way and uses it in the sense of an entire 24-hour period within the Gospels. And just like our word day can do the very same things, the Hebrew word Yom can do those same concepts. But what interested me is that it began with darkness and moved to day, and then back to darkness. That is the framework of day with the concept of a day in the Hebrew Old Testament. And as we figure that out, it helps us understand a little bit about what Jesus is saying. He is talking about we are living through this dark moment, and Jesus has dawned, as it were, the light of the beginning day, but now we are getting ready to slide into another dark period, and we're going to need something to hold us through that dark period in our history. The Revolutionary War began in 1775, actually in April of that year, with Lexington and Concord. The Continental Congress was caught flat-footed by the whole thing, and they were drawn together by this sudden urgent danger that was on the edge of their lives. And so they tried to figure out what to do. In 1775, they appointed George Washington in June to be the commander and chief of the Continental Army. The Continental Army was a dream at best and a nightmare in reality. We look back on it with all kinds of idealized imagination. But the Continental Army was made up of a ragtag group of militias drawn from the various colonies, and primarily from the colonies of New England. They were local people that very often were poorly equipped. They came to the fight wearing their own clothes and not a regular uniform. They came to the military with having older firearms and having, in many cases, no firearms at all, simply a small sidearm of a knife or even a farm implement. And that would be the equipment that they had for this battle. It was a dangerous time, and they were up against the most powerful military force in the world at that time. Britain was it. It was the top military force in the world. In addition to that, Washington took control of the army on July the 3rd in 1775. They weren't even a nation at that point. So having a standing army was a little bit beyond the scope right then. And most of the colonists, if you were to ask them what they wanted out of this whole thing, they wanted reconciliation with Britain. They had no concept of being independent. They just wanted to force Britain to recognize their rights as Englishmen. And so it was an interesting moment in history. And for a year, the whole process went along that way, and Washington was losing troops almost every day, especially during the winter, as they got tired and went home, and he was facing probable disbandment of the entire army. That's the point that we come to in July of 1776. The Continental Congress had been arguing for a long time, and Lee, who was the chairman of it, a man from Virginia, had stood up and said, we need to do something about independence. We're going to lose everything if we don't make a decision of independence here. And so they argued and struggled for the next few days until finally on July the 2nd, the Continental Congress voted to become independent. But that didn't make any difference to most of the people in the street. They didn't care much about that. John Adams would later believe that the Independence Day should be celebrated on July the 2nd because that was the day they voted for independence. But it made very little impact on the people in Philadelphia, and as it went out further, made even less impact in the rest of the colonies. They commissioned the drafting of a Declaration of Independence. That decision to draft that Declaration of Independence would change everything. And it became that day, that moment, that dividing point that would challenge Americans with the concept of their identity and their future. On July 4th, that document was presented to the Continental Congress for approval. I don't think they probably understood how important it was. Many of the people that signed it, it was months later before it was actually signed by all the participants because of various duties and things that were happening. But it made a difference in the public perception. Suddenly there was the idea that we are different, we are Americans, we are something unique and special in the world. What caught me when I read John chapter 11 was this kind of moment. Jesus says to his disciples plainly at one point, Lazarus is dead. His disciples had only thought he was ill, and Jesus had said he's sleeping, and they said, well, if he's sleeping, then he's getting better, and Jesus says, no, he's dead. We need to go and awaken him. And they are caught completely by surprise. They know what happened just a few weeks ago in Jerusalem. They know about the angry mob. They know about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin that are plotting his assassination. They know all of these things. And yet they also know Jesus is determined. And he says to them, it is good that I waited because God's glory is to be seen in this. And you needed to be there to see this. Now, the disciples had probably no desire to go back in the middle of that mob environment. But Thomas says something very interesting in this passage. He says, let us go to Jerusalem, or let us go back to Judea with him and die. It was there at the tomb of Lazarus that the disciples caught the vision for who Jesus really was. He was the Lord of life. He was the resurrection. In him life was. And when he said in John chapter 10, I am God, he now had the proof to back it up. He indeed was God. And what he said, even death had to obey. That is a profound and powerful moment. It would be this sustaining realization that would pull the disciples through, especially as they worked through the time of the crucifixion, and finally to that moment when Christ was resurrected and his authority was seen clearly in their lives. They went through that dark night again, but they emerged into the daylight. We will go through dark nights in our faith, but it is the truth of who Jesus is that brings us to that. And we need those days in our lives, those moments when we make that division between light and darkness that reminds us again and again who Jesus really is. and what he can do. I hope you realize what Jesus can do in your life, and I hope you celebrate being an American citizen. It is a wonderful privilege. God bless you. You have a wonderful, wonderful 4th of July if I don't see you in church. God bless.